Hey guys, welcome back once again. Another 20 minutes with Trey. And guys, I promise that I'm going to try to get as close to 20 minutes this time as possible. There's just been so much stuff going on in these texts, and we've been going like 30 minutes each time. So we've got a good one for you here. We're going to follow along in the story as we have been, and you guys probably remember still, if you've been following along, that we started at the very beginning, right? The very beginning of Genesis, very beginning of the Bible, very beginning of God's story. Remember, we learned that God wants us to know Him by His story. And so we've been following that story. And we started off with God creating. He makes all things. He makes it good, and He makes it flourishing, and it's bringing glory to Him. And He gives those God-glorifying things, those good things, to His image, which is man. Mankind is made in God's image. And so we have a relationship with Him. We have a relationship with each other. We are like God. And then last week we saw the fall into sin, mankind's fall into sin. They foolishly believed that they can define their own definition of good. But from that fall, we saw God's promise. In fact, His promise was an offspring. And so this offspring, the offspring of Eve, would defeat the curse of sin, would completely reverse this curse of sin. He would crush the serpent. Now we are following not only the story in general, but we're trying to find this offspring. Who will be the offspring in this story? That's what's driving our thoughts as we read this for now. And so Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel. That didn't work out, as we know. Then they had Seth, and so from Seth, maybe Seth is the offspring, and so we follow Seth's bloodline, and that goes down to Noah. So Noah had a few sons. Remember Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Well, turns out that Ham ends up getting cursed. Some shady stuff goes on, and Ham gets cursed. And guess who comes from the line of Ham? The Canaanites. And we'll see those in a little bit. In fact, we're going to see a lot of them in this story, in the Torah story. But Shem does not get cursed. Shem gets blessed. And so we're going to follow Shem's bloodline all the way down to, can you guess it? Abraham. We're following all the way down to Abraham. So the story is unfolding, and now we meet someone in the line of Adam, obviously, in the line of Noah, in the line of Shem. His name is Abram right now is his name. And you and I know him as Abraham. So let me get my notes here. We're going to be, if you want to really know Abraham, and especially if you really want to know God's covenants with Abraham, write these chapters down. Chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, and Genesis chapter 17. That's what we're going to look at today. Let's read Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It says this. It says God's covenant with Abram. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then if you skip down to verse 7, it says this, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who appeared to him." So here we see God stepping into history. If you just read this straight up, right before chapter 12 is actually just the bloodline, just the people. And this guy had this kid, and this guy had this kid, and he had this kid, and all the way down, all the way to Abram. And then all of a sudden, you know who shows up? The Lord. The Lord just shows up in history. God is the God of the Bible, is the God who steps into history. Not only did he create everything and he is bringing history about, but he doesn't stay distant. He steps into history. This is completely different from many, many, many other, in fact, most other so-called gods out there. So many are so distant, or they just kind of let humans just kind of fend for themselves, or even they might be against humans. Some ideas of God, but not this God. This God, the God of the Bible. Now we see the God of Abram. He is the God who steps into history. And so this is an initiating act of God. And we see that God loves to do this. God loves to be the initiator. He loves to pursue his people. He loves to pursue us even despite the fact that we are so deep in sin. And that's what he's doing right here. Remember last week, we saw the fall into sin, and then that fall led to the destruction of the whole earth in Noah's age. And then even after that, people were still sinful. They had the Tower of Babel. People were so entrenched in their sin. And what is God doing here? He is pursuing man, even despite the fact that they are so deeply entrenched in sin. I want to show you 3 things about this covenant that's going to be really important. And we'll talk about these 3 things in a little, not even a little bit, but almost every time from here on out, we're going to talk about these three things. The first one is this. The first of all, that this is a covenant itself. That God, the way that God relates to his people is through covenants. It's through covenants. It's not just, oh, I'm going to talk to you, or, oh, hey, this is a good day to do something great. No, he's going to make promises. He's going to make covenants that are not broken on his part. And so here we see that God comes to Abram and makes a covenant with Abram. And this is, actually in chapter 17, we're not going to read it today. I'm just going to throw in a couple of verses from chapter 17. But chapter 17 actually says that this is an everlasting covenant. So not only is this a covenant, but it's everlasting. It's promised, and that promise will not be broken. It will go on forever and ever and ever. It will be everlasting, this covenant. So this covenant is really important, isn't it? It's not just a passing or fleeting thing. It's not just something that's going to happen once, but it's everlasting. Secondly, got covenant. The second thing, let me just write this down. Covenant. Second thing is the land. Now, maybe you recognize this, but in the very beginning, God created what? Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, the Hebrew for that is literally the sky and the land. It means a totality of things. And so God created the land, and then he created a special land called Eden, and he created a special land within Eden called the Garden of Eden, and he brought Adam into it and created Eve, and Adam and Eve lived in this land. They lived in the land. Now that word land is very intentional because the author's going to use that word land over and over and over. And so in the garden, we see God creating a good land, and whenever Adam and Eve sinned, they got kicked out of the land. They were removed from the good, flourishing land. Are you tracking with me here? Now, this land is promised. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. This is a step back. This is a promise that we're going back to, quote unquote, back to Eden. Now, scholars kind of debate on whether this is literally back to Eden or not literally back, and that we're just, spiritually going back to Eden. Either way, that's definitely a legitimate thing to look into, biblically speaking. But we're not going to talk about that right now. We're just going to say, okay, the author wants us to see that this promise, this covenant that God makes with Abram is a promise that we are going to get back to Eden, and what Eden actually meant for Adam and Eve. They got to walk with God. They got to experience his presence. They were whole. The land was flourishing. It was good. Okay, so we're getting back to that. Sorry, I've got a hair in my eye. Okay, so we got land. We have covenant. Back to Eden. The covenant is everlasting. And then finally, we have offspring. So we've already talked about this. We saw that the offspring was promised in Genesis chapter 3 at the fall by God. It was promised by God. However, we see kind of the story of the offspring unfolding. So we know that this is coming, this offspring, this one offspring is coming through Abram now. But now we see that through his offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, this is mind-blowing. Not only is this one thing going to happen with one offspring reversing the curse, but through Abram, every single nation will be blessed. All the nations or peoples of the earth will be blessed. So remember these three things, that God makes covenants with his people, and this is an everlasting covenant, that God is giving them the land, giving Abram and his people the land. He's bringing them back into fellowship with him by bringing them back to quote-unquote Eden. And this story of the offspring is unfolding, and we know that through Abram, all the offspring, through Abram's offspring, all the people of the earth will be blessed. Okay, now I told you chapter 12, we talked about chapter 17, and we talked about chapter 15, or we're going to talk about now chapter 15. This once again is a kind of a deeper look into God's covenant with Abram. All right, so let's read verses 5 and 6. Yeah. First of all, we're going to read 5 and 6. It says, "And he brought him outside and said," this is God bringing Abram. He says, "Look toward the heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he, Abram, he believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. See, in chapter 12, we saw God's promise. And we see this as an everlasting promise. This is what I'm going to do, Abram. In chapter 15, we see Abram's response. Abram's response is faith. Abram's response is faith. There we go. Abram's response is faith. See, the author of Genesis, in fact, the author of all 5 books of the Torah is Moses, as we talked about before. But this author is trying to hold up for us an example of who we need to be as God followers. The ultimate example right here, we're gonna see the story of this guy, is Abram and his faith. So Abram responded in faith. We need to respond in faith. In fact, the only way that we're made right with God is through faith. It's not through our works. It's not through what we can do. It's not through our striving. Abraham saw that. Abraham knew that. He simply responded in believing who God is, believing who God said he is and what he would do, and trusting his promises. So we are now, as readers of the Bible and of this unfolding story, and as followers of this God, the God of Abraham, we are now to follow in the footsteps of Abraham's faith. If you want to learn more about that, read Romans 4. Not only did he trust God, but in chapter 12, we saw that he had to leave everything he knew to follow God and to obey his commands. He had to drop his culture. So let's talk about this. He had to drop his culture, what he was used to. He had to drop his family, what he was used to. He had to drop the job that he was used to, his normal routine. Everything that he knew, he had to turn from and go follow God. God said, go, leave all this stuff behind and go. And so That's the way that we need to respond to God, by responding in complete and utter obedience, dropping everything behind and following God. So, we've seen God's covenant. Now we've seen Abram's response, his faith. And in fact, we didn't read it. I think it's in 17. It ends up being in 17. We don't have time to read it today, but that's whenever God actually changes Abram's name to Abraham. And Abraham means a father of a multitude. Father of a multitude. And so he changes it to Abraham. All right, so we're going to finish. Our last point is right here also in chapter 15, verses 12. And I'm going to read 12 through the rest of it. Let's see how cool this covenant is. Now, usually you think of a covenant, you think of like a man and a wife making a covenant at the altar in the front of everyone, and the preacher's right there, and God's looking, and God's a part of this covenant, right? And so you got two sides to it. In fact, with the covenant marriage, true covenant marriage, you have God as well as part of this covenant. But you have two people who are faulty and who are making a covenant with each other, a covenant that can possibly be broken. Now, take that and compare it to what we're about to read. It says in chapter 15, verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell over Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And this is not starting off well. They will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nations that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant. There it is. The Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Man, there's so much there. First of all, real quick, did you notice the land that they're going to is the land, it's the Canaanites. This whole land is actually called the land of Canaan, and the Canaanites are part of this land of Canaan. That stems back from Noah. Noah's son, Ham, is cursed, and his people are going to be driven out of their land. Man, it's all coming together. Second of all, look what he says in verse 16. Why is he not giving them the land yet? Because he says that Abram's people are going to come back in the 4th generation, not right now, but the 4th generation, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Did you know that? That's why they went to Egypt. That's why he has them later go to Egypt, which we'll see. And why they have to wait so long. Because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete, and God was not done showing mercy to them yet. That once again shows God's heart, his merciful heart, his long-suffering heart. And so, but the reason why I wanted to show you this right here is because this is a covenant that God makes with Abram, and Abram's not even awake. Abram is not even really technically part of this. This is a completely one-sided covenant that God is making. He says, no, for sure this is going to happen. Your people are going to go to a place and become servants. And I'm going to wait 400 years to have mercy on the Amorites because their iniquity is not complete yet. It's not filled up. Then I'm going to bring you out and I'm going to give you the land. Know for certain. This one-sidedness is not like two faulty people standing up on an altar promising life to each other, promising the rest of their lives to each other. This is God, the faithful God, promising without Abram's say, without Abram holding up any side of any bargain. this is going to happen. This is what our whole faith is based off of, guys. It is God's initiating act and him coming and promising something that man cannot overcome. It cannot thwart the plans of God. This plan is going to come about, and Abram doesn't have anything to do with making it come about. That is God's prerogative, right? Obviously, Abram gets to be part of this big, awesome thing that God's going to bring about, and we're going to know his name forever, and we're going to know Abram's name forever. We talk about him all the time at church, right? But he is not the one that's going to make sure that this happens. God is. And so, man, I can't tell the time we have here, but there's a lot going on here. First of all, we saw the covenant. We saw God's response to the covenant. And we saw that this is an unbreakable covenant. Man, this promise is that even though man fell in Eden, God will bring us back. Even though man lost relationship with God, and the fact that we were like God, that got broken. Now we're like God, but we're not like God in his holiness, and we're not like God in his righteousness, and we don't have that deep, close relationship that we once had with God. God's going to restore that. God's going to bring us back to that. And our response as human beings, responding to God's promises here on the pages, is simple faith. Dropping everything that we have, everything that we know, everything that we love dearly that is holding us back from God, and having faith that God will come through on his promises. The offspring will come. And we know that offspring is Jesus. He has already come in our lives. And so God will complete the reversal of the curse. He will accomplish this not according to human standards, not according to human works or strivings or effort, but by the faithfulness of God himself and by the mercy of God, by his initiating work. And then finally we see that our response is trusting in what God has promised. So, man, there's just so much whenever we truly dig into these scriptures, whenever we see the story unfolding and we follow the story how it was written. Remember those three things: covenant, land, and offspring. Remember to ask the text, what does this say about God? What does this say about man? What does this say about our relationship? And then do it. Pray to God and do it. All right, see you guys next week. Love talking about Abram/Abraham with you guys this week. We'll see what happens next in the story. See you guys.